Hello everybody, and on the occasion of the announcement of the Prophet X by Dave Smith Instruments, I'll be chatting with Dave Smith today, the Grammy-winning enabler of MIDI, king of prophets and synthesizer veteran, who played a great role in paving the way for the return of hardware synthesizers as he was celebrating his comeback with the Evolver back in 2002. Hello Dave, how are you?
I'm great. How are you doing?
I'm good. And let's talk about the exciting news right away. The Prophet X marks the first time you've been involved in anything sampler related ever since you released the Prophet 3000 as the last instrument by Sequential back in 1987. And back in the day, the Prophet 3000 represented a true state-of-the-art instrument in terms of its sophisticated built-in sample editing and auto-looping capabilities. It was a 16-bit, 48 kHz, 8-voice stereo sampler expandable to 4 megabytes that came with a remote panel featuring a large backlit LCD display and a data wheel, both of which would already anticipate the design of the Wave Station, which you would co-develop afterwards. Now, while reviewers were raving about it almost immediately after its release, its production run was limited only to 250 units due to Yamaha taking over Sequential and eventually dumping the whole project, which was originally conceived as a user-configurable super synth, not unlike what became known as workstations. And in an interview with the Music Technology magazine from 1990, you eventually said, "I personally got bored pretty quickly with sampling. First of all, it's pretty easy to do technically, and then it's just a matter of forever adding features to the software." With all the analog polysynth goodies you've been delivering, particularly over the past couple of years, namely the Prophet 6, the OB6, the Rev 2, what made you consider returning to sampling technology after roughly 30 years? Did you meet for lunch with Dave Rossum? And when did you actually start collecting ideas for the Prophet X? That is, how far does it date back when we are talking about first ideas?
Well, it's been a long process. Originally, I did not want to build a sampler. I still didn't want to build what would be called a workstation or a Rompler because they've been around for 30 years and everybody has one and everybody has their software at home on their computers. So all of that's well covered. I also didn't want to have to develop a sample library. Because that's an awful lot of work that I don't want to do. But I did meet up with the folks at 8DO who do have a monstrously huge sample library. And we started talking, occasionally a while back saying, well, wouldn't it be fun to do a hardware version that uses these samples? And it eventually got to the point where we thought we'd give it a try.
And when did that start? 2 years ago or something, or longer?
I don't know, roughly a couple of years ago. I mean, we started it overlapping with other products like the Rev 2 that just came out, I guess about almost a year ago. And then just in the last year, we've been working on it, getting it ready for production.
So what was the conceptual goal behind the Prophet X? Was it planned as an actual response to the lack of performance-oriented samplers?
Well, we're trying to do what we do with our other instruments. We try to come up with something that has a good feel, a personality, easy to interact with, that is different from everything else out there. Like you said, we're not trying to replace Nord or Korg or, we're trying to come up with something different. We think our samples, have a lot of personality to them. Some people may say, oh, that's not perfect. And other people say this plays really well because it's more natural. We've got a huge number of samples, of course. And I've always been a big fan of digital through analog filters. And that's one thing that's been missing with all the samplers out there is analog filters. So we have stereo high quality samples being played through stereo filters. And so it's meant to be something new. And we know that not everybody is, some people are going to expect it to be, multi-timbral this, and I want to tweak every last sample to the exact sample point and this and that. And that's not really the purpose of it. It's or the idea. So the idea is you play it and it sounds good and it has a different sound to it and takes you in different directions, like our other instruments, has that personality to it. And we hope that people like it.
You already pointed in many directions I want to go to. First of all, let's stay with HDO, and that's the company you collaborated with.
Yes.
With regard to the sampling content, it's a company that was founded in 2011, has been releasing over 40 sample-related products that are widely used in music, film, and the gaming industry. And how did this collaboration come about in the first place? And how did you decide what samples to select?
Well, we actually, as it turns out, we live about a mile away from each other in the middle of Napa Valley. So that was part of it. That's how we originally met a few years back. As far as the sample content, we just let them decide. There's too much there. It's too big of a job. So we just kind of threw everything in there and let them decide what was best because that's what they do. And, again, I haven't done samples and, even now I couldn't tell you what's on all the other products and I can't keep, there's too much. So I don't know. But that's how we approached it.
The Prophet X features two oscillators that play back stereo sampled audio signals, and it provides modulatable control of the sample's start and end points and the center position, in addition to a sample stretch mode per instrument. How far, I guess this is going to be a question that's going to be around almost immediately upon its announcement. How far can you actually zoom into a sample? Do the modulation capabilities also allow for granular synthesis?
I wouldn't say it gets quite to the granular point. Again, it really wasn't the purpose of the instrument to allow super deep sampling. So no, you cannot, there's not a wave shape display. There's not editing down to the sample level. The idea is we give you all these great samples. You use them however you want. If you want to go in real quickly and just set some loop points, it's really fast at doing that. But again, if you want micro precision editing of everything, then again, it's not really the concept of the instrument.
But there is going to be a user sampling mode that is going to be available in roughly 6 months, I was told. And I assume that it's going to be made available via a firmware update. And what are the challenges in that regard, and why the delay?
Well, part of it is we're going to need an app that works on the computer so that you can build your sound sets. We call them groups. And then basically you download it onto a USB stick and put it in the instrument and load them in. When the unit is first shipping, ATO will have some add-on packs available. That same thing, you buy them from them, you put it on a USB stick, you put it in the instrument and you download it. And this is huge amounts of data. We're going to have 40 or 50 gigabytes available for user space. So it made sense to do it. That was just the easiest way for us to do it. So it's just going to take us a while to get the mapping tool done for users. So we don't want to say it's going to be ready in 2 months, but we think we'll have it done by December.
And is the app going to be available for free or for the buyers?
The current plan would be it would be free.
On all platforms then, iOS, Mac OS, and Windows?
Presumably. Again, we haven't worked out the details, but at least, yeah, Windows and Mac would be obvious.
What's the sample format?
Probably just WAV files, but we haven't decided how far to go in conversions and drag and drop and that sort of thing. Those are some of the things we are going to be looking into also.
And the onboard capacity is?
It ships with like closer to 150 gigabytes.
150 gigabytes. That's quite massive.
Yes, it's almost too big. ATO is known for deep sampling. So we have a lot of sounds that are very deeply sampled. So you could get very specific on the particular flavor that you want.
Okay. One burning question with regard to the sampling engine, though. Why did you decide not to include audio inputs?
Mostly because we're trying to make it a more concise instrument. And as soon as you add audio input, then you have to have a huge UI component in order to use that, to do it properly. So we'd have to put a bigger screen on there. We'd have to add all the editing software. It's useless unless you have a way of processing it quickly and easily. This is also the first sample unit we've built in a while, and we didn't want to try to. It's like what you quoted earlier. The reason I haven't done this in a long time is there's no end in sight for what people are going to want. So we tried to have this be a more concise instrument. Yes, you will be able to get your user samples in there, but it's, again, not meant to be that type of instrument because those are everywhere and you already have one, and this is what this instrument does.
Moving on to the other pair of oscillators, are the digital oscillators the ones that don't play back samples based on the DSP design of the Prophet 12s or Pro 2s oscillators?
Yes, they're basically the same.
Just with a selection of analog waveforms exclusively. And that provokes the question about what made you choose to incorporate two digital oscillators instead of two analog oscillators, be they DCOs or VCOs, with regard to the actual waveform content. Was it to keep the Prophet X distinct enough from the hybrid front end of the Evolver, or was it simply the ease of implementation?
It's a little of everything. One of the concepts, you have to remember that this is one of the only true stereo synthesizers that you can get. The other, I think the Evolver is probably the only other true stereo synth where it has analog filters in both channels. So we wanted to take advantage of that and say, well, you could turn off the samples and just play this as a stereo synthesizer with all the modulation and everything. And it's quite capable in that way. But we also found there's a whole lot of real simple things you can do with the oscillators that work really well with the samples. One simple trick that I'm sure we're not the only ones who've done is you just turn on a sine wave and you add it to anything, and it just gives it a little bit more fullness. You could drop it down an octave, and now all of a sudden it's a little bit of a sub. But the sine waves on this work incredibly well with samples. It just gives it a little extra body. It's hard to describe, but so the whole synthesis engine has a number of different directions it can go.
You already mentioned the comeback of an Evolver feature, the stereo filter. What made you incorporate this configuration again? And since there is a whole palette of different DSI filters by now, what kind of chip are the filters based upon, and what type of filters are we dealing with?
Well, they're 4-pole low-pass resonant filters. It's a new filter design. Typically we don't like to talk too much about the specifics of the circuit, but having the stereo samples, we wanted to have stereo analog filters. So we actually have 16 filters in there, but so it works with it. Again, I said it earlier, there's just something about the digital going through the analog filters that gives it's hard to describe. I hate to use all the usual words of, fat or warm or whatever, but it does. It's a real thing. We have a mode where you can actually bypass the filters with the oscillators if you want, or with the samples if you want to, depending on what you're doing, because that way you can actually have kind of a synth engine and a sample engine separate. Uh, and it's interesting just to turn the filters on and off and listen to it. It's also interesting to note that we have a 16 voice mode where everything collapses to mono and you have a single filter per voice, even though you can still pan after that. And of course, the effects are all stereo. You get the advantage of being able to play twice as many voices.
How's that actually working? I mean, in technical terms, that is, what is actually happening when one switches between both modes? Is it based on the principle of differently routed layers?
Yeah, we have the filters are configurable, so we just sum the channels of the samples and run it through a single filter instead of two. So a different sound and more keys. Yeah, and some sounds it's still, some sounds of stereo you just have to have it because it just sounds great. But other times you can get by without it.
And you also doubled the number of effects to 2 per layer, which effectively allows you to use up to 4 different effects simultaneously now in bitimbral mode. And did you also add effect types?
I think we added a couple. We added a rotating speaker, Leslie effect, for obvious reasons. Let's see, was there anything else added? I can't remember it. Every time we come out with a new product, we add a couple effects. So definitely remember the rotating speaker.
And are they modulatable, the effect parameters?
Okay. Yes, everything is, all the parameters are modulation destinations.
Particularly the sample-based oscillators, the true stereo signal path, and the 2 effects per layer made me wonder whether you've been picking up on some of the suggestions and wishes articulated in your forum. Have those been relevant to some of the design choices, or did these ideas just float around for quite some time already?
Well, I have a bad habit of not ever going to forums, so I can't say that there has been much of that. Other people, check that out, and that there could have been suggestions indirectly from forums, but I find forums too distracting, and it makes it more difficult to come up with a concise concept for an instrument if you start thinking you have to do everything else, because it's the same thing for looking at other instruments and trying to keep track of them. It's sometimes that's not a good idea. Maybe I should keep a better track on what's out there, but it seems to work pretty well.
Here's a question that is to be expected with regard to your common release policy. Is there also going to be a Prophet X module once the user sampling mode has been made available?
No plans at the moment. In this case, it's going to be a little harder to squeeze everything into a module because of the amount of circuitry. It could be done, but it would end up being, almost as big. And we might, it depends on demand. But as opposed to our other products, you're right. We usually work on it right away, like on the Rev 2 or the Prophet 6 and the OB6, but in this case, we have not made a decision yet.
Attentive observers could notice that you already dropped a hint about the Prophet X while you were being interviewed at last year's Moogfest. There you mentioned that the upcoming instrument would be a Prophet something that probably wouldn't be named Prophet unless you couldn't find a better name. Yeah. What made you choose the name Prophet again? Do you have such a lack of confidence in anything but the Prophet label?
There's a number of reasons. One is that it's very difficult to come up with a new name that hasn't already been taken, or some version of it that hasn't already been taken. There are so many software products out there now all over the place, and everybody picks names. And so, a lot of times we'll come up with a great name and somebody's already taken it. So that's one side. And we didn't want to just put a name on it for the sake of putting a name on it. But on the other side, of course, there is a lot of value and to the Prophet name. So there's really no reason not to use it because people recognize it, and it's just a good idea from that sense.
What made you choose the Sequential brand again for the Prophet X?
It just seemed like a good time. We only have one sequential product so far, the Prophet 6. And, it's always hard deciding what product should be what name, but this just, as a high-end product, seemed like a logical choice.
The user interface design, and in particularly the graphics done by Andrew McGovern, obviously play a huge role in what makes your instruments highly attractive and easy to work with. And for very good reasons, you've been recently featured in Kim Björn's book Push, Turn, Move, which focuses on how design is not just something of a mere aesthetic value, but a truly functional ingredient that can actually define what makes an instrument in the first place. Within that book, you've been quoted saying, with reference to the Prophet X, I assume, we are working on a product right now where we have moved things around quite a bit, and you just try out different things, and at some point it just feels right. End of quote. Can you tell us a bit more about how you and Andrew approach interface design questions and what the process was like in the case of the Prophet X? Like how, for example, do you start the design process? How are features prioritized? How much do product management considerations such as avoiding overlaps between certain products inform your decisions? And how does the design of an instrument, in this case the Prophet X, usually evolve over the course of its conceptual phase? What elements simply have to be in there, irrespective of the actual instrument's voice architecture? And finally, what comes first in terms of designing, the user interface or the voice architecture?
I could talk for hours on all of that. The first thing is there's no general rule. We don't go through the exact same process every time, but roughly, we have a small group of people, and everybody's a synth nut. We all understand how things work. So we always usually start with a concept, like in this case, okay, samples, true analog filters. So the next step, we'll spend a lot of time just on a whiteboard drawing up front panel designs or parts of panels. And the hard part to describe is the interaction of what goes on underneath the hood versus what we draw for front panel controls, because both of them have to correspond. And it takes a lot of time where we just go back and forth. And usually at some point we have enough described where Andrew could go away and start working on initial layouts of a real front panel, and those will be very rough at first. We'll just do a whole section like, okay, well, here's the filter section, here's the mod section, this is one way we could do this sample section and the effects section, and we spend a lot of time massaging that before. And the panel just keeps getting more and more described as we go along until at some point we actually have something that is complete. And as I always say, the hardest part in design is knowing what to leave out, not what to put in. And that was even more difficult on this product because, again, there's so many directions you can go with a sampler. And we wanted to keep things a little bit more streamlined, a little bit more synthy and less. We didn't want a whole bunch of rows of switches and a huge screen in the middle that has 8,000 modes and, where you can't just do something by reaching in and turning a knob. So on this one, you call up a program and there's the cutoff knob where it usually is, and you turn it and do what you're expected to do. And if you want to tweak the envelopes, they're right there. If you want to change the sample, it's right there. If you want to change the effect, you turn it on and off. So it's very easy to use, very straightforward compared to a lot of the workstations. Now, the other side of that is, it doesn't do as much as the workstations because those things do everything these days. And that wasn't the concept. We want this to be a musical instrument, not a workstation. So the design process, again, it's hard to define beyond that, without getting into very specifics, but that's roughly how we do it.
Less work, more fun.
Yes. Yeah, I never understood the name workstation. It's supposed to be fun to play, not work. And workstations are, if you think about it, those samplers are kind of work. If you're a touring keyboard player, you need something to play your pianos on it, and it's just basically the work side of things. This is, I look at it as more of a musical instrument that has its own personality, and it brings a different part to to the musician.
Moving to the inside of your instruments, as a company who's releasing new synthesizers that typically contain an elaborate modulation matrix on an almost annual basis, how do you organize the firmware development? I mean, is there a shared code base at the core of all of your instruments? I'm asking this question as some parts of the OS are specific to individual instruments, whereas others rely on common components across multiple instruments. And especially in the aftermath of the Prophet 12, one could observe that you streamlined a lot of your instruments' menu structures and the overall parameter availability. It was a bit like spring cleaning. And does that in turn mean that you've been progressing towards a common library of possible extensions for all of your instruments, or like a toolkit?
Not formally, but clearly if we have a modulation matrix that everybody knows how to use and it's easy and simple, and we have the code for it, there's no reason not to use it. Of course, the sources and destinations may change unit to unit depending on the design, but those are easy changes. This one had a pretty huge new software component for the sampling engine, of course. But yeah, without going into detail on the design, of course, if we have something that works, there's no reason to start it and change how it looks. So yeah, we 4 LFOs, as we always do, because they work well and they're easy to use, and they make a lot of sense on this instrument like they would on another instrument.
Within that context, what's your take on FPGAs as configurable audio platforms?
Well, we use FPGAs in a lot of our products. We have a lot of audio flying around. We have a lot of control voltages flying around. Prophet 6 has over 100 control voltages in it, updated at audio rates. And yes, you need FPGAs to do those sort of things. We still prefer to use a real processor to do the processing point. I mean, there's no reason to just make an FPGA to crank out a bunch of oscillators, for example. In our case, we try to keep things more general purpose.
On January 28th, the MIDI Manufacturers Association officially announced its adoption of the MIDI polyphonic expression enhancement of the MIDI specification to ensure standardized MPE-based interoperability for the future. With that in mind, and more gestural controllers arriving on the market, do you have any plans to support MPE on your instruments anytime soon? I'm not really asking this question for consumerist reasons, but with regard to the complex voice architecture that usually comes with your instruments, which seems to be an ideal precondition for the kind of expression multidimensional controllers provide.
It's something we'll probably eventually do. We do get requests for it, but it's like, there's a lot of things we get requests for. A lot of people wanted alternate tunings for a long time, and we eventually got around to doing it. And now once we implement something, we tend to put it on all the instruments. And this is like that. From what we can tell, there's not a huge amount of people who want it. There are definitely some who do, and someday we'll do it. But most of our customers tend to be people who just play keyboards and are not necessarily interested in using a lot of alternate controllers. So all I can say is, yeah, probably someday we'll do it, but there's not a specific plan yet.
There's another feature you already hinted at, which is multi-timbrality, which is coming up more and more in certain discussions. Now, especially you have units like, the Electron Octa track around, for which a perfect companion would be something like a multi-timbral synth or voice unit. How's your take on that? Would it be too complicated to implement in the kind of instruments you do, like hybrid and analog instruments?
Well, design-wise, it's not complicated, but that gets back to, what is the concept for the instrument. Adding multi-timbral and doing it right does add, reasonable amount of UI components to, make it easy to use. And again, our instruments are not always for that market. You know, if you want to do that, there are things that you get plenty of different voices out. And our things are usually bitemporal. We have talked about doing an instrument that would be more specific for multi-timbral use, so we could do it right and include the right interface. Because we did that on the Tetra. It was multi-timbral, but we didn't really have the UI to support it. So people, well, this sure it's multi-timbral, but it doesn't do it the way I want it to, and it's almost better to not put it in than to put it in if it's not perfectly implemented. So, our products have been very successful the last few years because they do what they do, they do it well, and people like the fact that they're simple and they're reliable, and they just pick them up, play them, and go. And sure, we could sell more if they were multi-timbral, but then they're not going to be quite so simple, and a lot of other things come into play. So it's just a design choice.
Whenever I'm on a synth-related forum, I realize that some people seem to think of Dave Smith Instruments as a big company, rather comparable to something like Korg, as opposed to what's usually being associated with a boutique manufacturer. So maybe that's because of the size of your instruments, or a result of the fact that you've been releasing new full-sized synths pretty much non-stop over the past years. Would you mind telling us how your company actually looks like and what other people are involved with the design and engineering process? Like all the unsung heroes that share the brainstorming and development sessions with you or take care of continuous customer support, which most people are not aware of, although they're essential for the success of Dave Smith Instruments.
Well, briefly, we're a small company. There's only 14 of us, which is exactly what lets us do things quickly because we don't have to deal with a big company organization. Plus, I've been doing this for 40 plus years, so we have a good feel for how to do things and do it efficiently. So, basically we have 3 software guys, 1 hardware guy. We have 4 people in customer and technical support, which I have always said is incredibly important. We try to support people as well as we can because it's easy to do taking care of customers. We try to make our stuff as reliable as possible. But everybody does a lot of different things. So they'll help out when we're testing products. They'll help out, in voicing or working on new products. Everybody contributes everywhere. So that's how it works. We're just very efficient. Yeah, it is. People are kind of surprised how much we can do and how well things work and how well we can support them. But that's because we're very efficient.
As of late, the music industry has been going through some major shifts. More and more boutique manufacturers are empowered through online business options and the direct interaction with customers. Old distribution models are fading away, and some manufacturers are starting to skip once mandatory events like the NAMM show or Messe Frankfurt, partially due to exorbitant fees being involved, while other, more specialized events took a leap forward like Moogfest or NobCon in the US and Superbooth in Europe. In January then, your friend Roger Lynn posted the following statement on his website. Going to NAMM? We are not. Like Moog, Dave Smith Instruments and Tom Oberheim, I, Roger, have decided to skip it this year. It seems odd to me to have a music product dealer convention in the internet era, given that there are so few remaining independent music production dealers. Now, apart from the fact that you obviously didn't have a finished product yet to show around the time of Winter NAMM, what's your take on that?
Every year we talk about whether to go or not. And it's a big expense, obviously, but the bigger problem for us as a small company is that it's a big distraction. It just takes a lot of time to prepare. You waste a week going down, setting up, doing the whole thing. So it's a big time waster that we could be working on new products instead. And this year we didn't have anything ready to show. We actually did go, and we just got a hotel room, and we brought a couple of Prophet X's, and we showed them to a handful of artists and dealers. So, but we just didn't bring the whole company. We did it very quickly and easily, just for a couple of days, and that, in this case, worked much better. And usually we go just to meet with our friends and meet with other companies and meet with artists and meet with the dealers. It's a good thing to do. and we have fun with it, but it's certainly not necessary on a dollar and cents basis. We'll sell just as much if we don't go, and we save the expense of going. And, we will be going. We went to Super Boot 2 years ago, and I think we're going this year. We had some products at Load Fest last year. Those are different though. Those are consumer shows, which is a big difference between talking to dealers. And but we'll take it year by year. We're not trying to make any big statement. It's we'll see what happens. Traditionally, NAMM was the only show we do. We just don't do anything else. So it's kind of minimal. Our instruments tend to speak for themselves. Our business is word of mouth. Artists will be in a studio and they'll see one and then they decide to buy it, or they'll be recording with some friends, or they'll see somebody play. And I think that's where we get most of our sales, because a lot of our sales tend to be with professional musicians. And, so it's not as necessary. We don't have a sales and marketing team. We have one person who handles that, and we don't go out and chase dealers down. All of our business has been long-term, year to year, where dealers come to us because customers come in and request our products. So that's how we grow, not really from shows.
Throughout his life, Bob Moog was fascinated by the theremin from the time he started building and selling kits as a teenager to his later days. And Roger Lynn originally started as a guitarist and songwriter and still plays the guitar up to this day, which would even influence the Lindström's design. Mm-hmm. And what's the instrument that stayed with you through the years? Is there any type of instruments you find yourself returning to, no matter what you're currently working on?
Not really. I still pick up my old guitars once in a while, and I do have a nice piano in the house, though I actually haven't played it much lately. There's a while there where I tend to play the guitars and the piano more, because working with synthesizers all day, you need something different, and it's a good reminder of the look and feel of a classic normal wood and string-based instrument. There's something different about them that it's good to keep in your head because we try to design electronic instruments that have that same look and feel. So. But I'm not nearly the same. I'm not a musician at the same level that Roger is, or a lot of other people. So I'm just, it's hobbyist level only.
Are you a Strat, Tele, or Gibson guy?
In the old days, I was always a Tele guy. I never liked the Strats. I didn't mind the Les Pauls, but I was a Tele guy. Now I've got an old Rickenbacker 12-string that I got in 1969. I have a Parker Fly that I like, and I have an acoustic guitar, steel string. So, yeah.
Right, and it's a good note to end upon. And I really want to thank you for taking your time in what must be a very busy period, I assume.
Yes.
And as always, it was a great pleasure talking to you.
Thanks. Okay, we'll talk to you later.
Talk to you later. Bye.
Bye.